For the first time in decades, the blue flag of the United Nations was told to leave, not by a great power, not by a wealthy state, but by a small landlocked nation in West Africa. In New York, that flag still waves proudly over glass towers of diplomacy. But in Ouagadougou, the same flag became a wound seen not as protection, but as intrusion. On the Sahel's dusty front lines, soldiers with rifles held together by tape-fight extremists who never filed human rights reports, never signed peace treaties. And when those same soldiers were placed in the same category as the terrorists they fight, the response was thunderous. On the 18th of August, 2025, the government of Captain Ibrahim Traoré declared the UN's top envoy persona non grata. 3 Latin words heavy with meaning. You are not welcome. Leave. It was not a whisper of protest. It was a cry of sovereignty. Was it a reckless gamble that risks isolation? Or was it the defiant heartbeat of a people who have learned that dignity is worth any cost? Stay with us. This is more than a headline. It is a turning point history will remember. Subscribe and stand with us. It began with a document drafted thousands of miles away in air-conditioned rooms, written in the neutral tones of bureaucracy. Yet when it reached Ouagadougou, it struck like a thunderbolt. In mid-August 2025, the United Nations published its annual report on children and armed conflict. Within its pages were harrowing accounts of child recruitment, attacks on schools, and the exploitation of minors across war zones. For diplomats in Geneva or New York, this was routine, a somber but familiar catalog of violations. But for the government of Burkina Faso, one passage cut deeper than bullets. There, in black and white, the Burkinabe armed forces were listed alongside extremist groups, Al-Qaeda in the Islamic Maghreb and the so-called Islamic State in the Greater Sahara. In the eyes of the UN, these were all actors accused of child-related violations. In the eyes of Burkina Faso, the comparison was obscene. How could the very soldiers who risked their lives daily to shield villages from jihadist attacks be placed in the same category as the murderers who bombed markets, abducted schoolgirls, and massacred civilians? To equate defenders with destroyers in the language of Ouagadougou was to blur the very line that gave meaning to the war, the line between protection and terror. The backlash was immediate. Commentators on state television brandished the report like an indictment and asked, if our army is labeled criminal, who will defend our people tomorrow? The nuance of international law vanished in the storm of anger. What remained was the sense of betrayal that the sacrifices of young men and women on the Sahel front lines were being dismissed as cruelty rather than courage. For the government of Captain Ibrahim Traoré, the insult was not technical. It was existential. The report was read as an act of delegitimization, a blow not only against the army but against the nation itself. The timing only sharpened the sting. At that very moment, Burkinabe forces were stretched thin, defending border regions under siege, burying comrades killed in ambushes, and protecting classrooms from being turned into barracks by extremists. To soldiers on the ground, the UN's language seemed to erase their sacrifice. To ministers in the capital, it risked undermining morale, weakening partnerships, and even granting propaganda victories to jihadist groups. If international institutions declared that the state's army was no different from the insurgents, what message would that send to citizens clinging to fragile hope? Thus, on the 18th of August, 2025, Ouagadougou made its move. In a formal communiqué, the Ministry of Foreign Affairs declared the United Nations resident coordinator, Carol Flores Moreniac, persona non grata. In diplomatic practice, this is no small gesture. It is one of the sharpest arrows in the quiver of statecraft, a declaration that an official has lost legitimacy and must leave without delay. Usually, such measures are reserved for foreign ambassadors accused of espionage or grave misconduct, not for representatives of the world's largest multilateral institution. That Burkina Faso, a nation still reliant on humanitarian aid, would use this tool against the UN was almost unthinkable. And yet, for the government, it was inevitable. The announcement reverberated far beyond Ouagadougou. Diplomats in West African capitals were stunned. Analysts in New York whispered about the precedent. For decades, it had been assumed that small nations, dependent on aid and international goodwill, would never dare to cross such a line. But in one stroke, Burkina Faso had redrawn the rules. The symbolism was unmistakable. Images soon spread, the blue UN flag fluttering peacefully in New York, while in the Sahel dust, Burkinabe soldiers with rifles patched by tape stood guard over villages. Two worlds colliding: bureaucracy versus battlefield, committee rooms versus craters, words versus wounds. And as the shockwave spread, one truth became clear. This was not merely a quarrel over a report. It was the opening act of a larger drama, a small nation demanding the right to define its own struggle, to tell its own story, and to defend its dignity against the judgment of global institutions. But this was only the spark. The firestorm came with the reactions. The announcement on the 18th of August was not wrapped in polite language. It was sharp, final, and almost unheard of in modern diplomatic practice. Burkina Faso had crossed a threshold. Within hours, the government framed the expulsion as more than a legal act. It was a shield raised around the dignity of its soldiers. On national television, Captain Ibrahim Traoré addressed the nation with the measured tone of a soldier who had walked the battlefield. "We are not expelling a person. We are expelling an attitude that dares to equate our martyrs with murderers, our soldiers with terrorists." Burkina Faso will not accept foreign judgment over the sacrifices of its sons and daughters. The words echoed across Ouagadougou. Crowds gathered in the central square, many carrying homemade placards. Some read, "Our sovereignty is not for sale." Others declared, "Hands off our army." The chants rolled like thunder through the streets. For citizens bruised by years of violence, this moment was not abstract diplomacy. It was a point of pride, a refusal to bow. The contrast was stark. In New York, officials whispered in hushed committee rooms, wondering how to respond. In Ouagadougou, voices rose in defiance. Mothers who had buried sons in the fight against jihadists said aloud what many felt, that comparing their children to terrorists was an insult beyond forgiveness. Students, frustrated by years of school closures, joined demonstrations, shouting that dignity mattered more than aid. For Traoré's government, the strategy was clear. By framing the expulsion as a defense of soldiers and martyrs, the issue was no longer about paperwork or protocol. It was about blood and sacrifice. Every Burkinabe who had lost a relative in the conflict could see themselves in the argument. The UN had not just insulted an army, it had insulted families, villages, and an entire nation. The shockwaves extended beyond the streets. Regional diplomats were taken aback. In Bamako and Niamey, leaders of Mali and Niger, already on a parallel path of distancing themselves from Western institutions, watched closely. To them, Burkina Faso's action was not reckless but revolutionary, a precedent that might embolden others. Internationally, the reactions split along predictable lines. Analysts in Washington described the move as dangerous, warning that Burkina Faso was risking isolation. Editorials in Paris were even harsher, calling the captain reckless, a young leader playing with fire. But inside Burkina Faso, those criticisms only reinforced the sense of pride. Citizens felt their nation had finally stood tall, refusing humiliation. The symbolism spread online. Side-by-side images appeared, the UN's blue flag in New York against the backdrop of skyscrapers, and Burkinabe soldiers standing in Sahel dust with rifles slung over their shoulders. For supporters, the message was clear: bureaucrats write in safety, our defenders bleed in silence. At home, ministers hardened the rhetoric. Government spokesmen accused the UN of legitimizing terrorism by placing soldiers and insurgents in the same category. They insisted that Burkina Faso welcomed partnership, but not paternalism. Partnership meant respect. Aid that came with humiliation was no longer acceptable. This narrative resonated deeply with ordinary people. In radio interviews, farmers in rural provinces said, "We would rather struggle with dignity than eat with shame." Youth in Ouagadougou voiced similar sentiments. "If others write our story, we no longer exist." The expulsion was thus redefined not as a rupture but as a liberation. What shocked diplomats most was not only the act itself, but the precedent it set. Yes, nations have expelled ambassadors. Yes, aid agencies have been forced to leave countries in crisis. But for a fragile state at war to expel the top UN representative was a thunderclap. It told the world that sovereignty mattered more than approval, that dignity weighed heavier than assistance. And in that moment, on the streets of Ouagadougou, pride drowned out fear. Citizens rallied behind their leader, chanting his name, echoing his words. Ibrahim Traoré had cast the confrontation not in the language of isolation, but in the language of honor. Yet behind the applause lingered a deeper uncertainty. Expelling the UN's envoy had been a bold gesture, but what would come next? Would aid be cut? Would schools lose international support? Would the wounded still receive medicine flown in by humanitarian agencies? The cheers in Ouagadougou were loud, but so too were the questions whispered in quieter corners. And beyond the cheers and anger came the cold question, what price would follow? The expulsion of the United Nations top representative was not an act that could be contained within diplomatic corridors. Its ripple effects reached classrooms, hospitals, and refugee camps. For Burkina Faso, already wounded by years of violence and displacement, the consequences were immediate and human. In the short term, the risk was clear. Aid programs coordinated by the UN could be disrupted. Food distributions in the north, where families depend on sacks of grain flown in from abroad, faced uncertainty. Schools supported by international donors worried about losing resources for teachers and supplies. In health centers stretched thin by waves of displaced people, the absence of UN coordination threatened the delivery of medicine and vaccines. For many Burkinabe, the fear was not abstract. It meant asking whether tomorrow their children would eat, or whether clinics would have the drugs to save lives. Yet the government argued the opposite. Officials insisted that dignity came first, that sovereignty was worth the hardship. In their words, foreign support could not come at the expense of national honor. By expelling the UN envoy, they claimed to be protecting morale not only of soldiers, but of the people themselves. To remain silent, they said, would have been a betrayal of those who had fallen on the front lines. Still, tension grew between pride and practicality. Citizens in Ouagadougou might cheer in the streets, but in the camps of the displaced, parents worried quietly about food and education. The paradox was unavoidable. In defending sovereignty, the state risked straining the very lifelines that kept its most vulnerable alive. In the medium term, the political implications were profound. Burkina Faso had long been viewed internationally as fragile, a country in need of external support. By rejecting the UN's authority, it signaled that it would no longer accept the role of passive recipient. The message was revolutionary. A small nation could stand on its own terms, even if it meant defying global institutions. This stance resonated far beyond Burkina Faso's borders. Across the Sahel, citizens in Mali and Niger spoke of a shared struggle, a collective rejection of what they saw as paternalism from international organizations. Commentators in African media praised the act as a turning point, a small country, often overlooked, declaring that sovereignty outweighed dependency. But sovereignty came with risks. Diplomats warned that by isolating itself, Burkina Faso might lose leverage in negotiations, funding for development, and channels for humanitarian relief. Opposition voices, though muted, questioned whether the government was gambling with people's survival. International NGOs hinted that without UN coordination, operations could slow or even collapse. And yet, inside the country, the rhetoric of dignity grew stronger. The government presented the choice not as between aid and isolation, but between humiliation and survival. In this framing, accepting the UN report's language would have been surrender. Expulsion was resistance. Here lies the heart of the dilemma. For ordinary Burkinabe, sovereignty was not an academic concept. It was the right to decide who defined their defenders, who judged their sacrifices. For years, promises of international protection had dissolved into dust while villages burned. Against that backdrop, many felt that dignity was not a gamble, but the only path left. Captain Ibrahim Traoré himself framed the issue in existential terms. For him, sovereignty was not negotiable, and the morale of soldiers was sacred. To allow their reputation to be stained by international reports was to weaken the shield that stood between citizens and terror. By expelling the envoy, he signaled that no external institution could dictate the meaning of sacrifice. This moment crystallized a larger truth. The people of Burkina Faso were willing to endure hardship if it meant standing tall. For them, the pain of poverty was less unbearable than the humiliation of being misrepresented. In their eyes, dignity was survival. The symbolism was powerful. Just as their ancestors had resisted colonial domination, so too did this generation reject the idea that global institutions could speak over their experience. The expulsion was not just an act of defiance, it was a declaration of independence in the 21st century. And yet, beneath the rhetoric, the humanitarian risks remained unresolved. Could a nation bruised by insurgency truly withstand reduced support? Could dignity feed the displaced, heal the sick, or reopen shuttered schools? These were the questions whispered not in rallies, but in homes and markets. This is where the story sharpened. Burkina Faso had chosen the path of pride, but the world waited to see whether that pride would be sustainable. The crossroads between sovereignty and survival was no longer theoretical. It was lived daily in empty classrooms, in silent clinics, in camps where aid might no longer arrive. The gamble of Ibrahim Traoré had been made, but would it secure dignity or deepen vulnerability? And while the world debated isolation, Burkina Faso turned to new allies. Burkina Faso now stands at a fragile crossroads. On one side lies the shield of sovereignty, defended fiercely by Captain Ibrahim Traoré and echoed by citizens who believe dignity is priceless. On the other side lies the undeniable risk of isolation from institutions that channel food, medicine, and international recognition. The decision to expel the UN's envoy was not just a diplomatic gesture, it was a gamble on the future. If global partners interpret it as hostility, humanitarian pipelines may weaken. Refugee camps could face shortages, schools might close, and fragile health systems could strain further. Yet to the government, these are risks worth bearing. For the alternative, accepting humiliation would mean erasing the nation's very identity. The road ahead offers both peril and promise. In the short run, Burkina Faso may pivot more strongly toward alternative partners. The Alliance of Sahel States, AES, already binding together Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger, could become the nucleus of a new regional solidarity, one based not on aid dependency, but on collective defense and self-reliance. Beyond the Sahel, partnerships with Russia, China, and Turkey provide other avenues. Moscow offers military cooperation, Beijing promises infrastructure, Ankara highlights humanitarian bridges. None are without strings, yet together they represent a counterweight to Western dominance. Domestically, the challenge will be even greater. Can sovereignty feed the displaced? Can dignity rebuild schools? Can pride keep hospitals supplied? These are the questions that Burkina Faso must answer if it is to transform defiance into sustainable progress. For the people in dusty villages, sovereignty must mean more than slogans. It must mean safety, food, and opportunity. Yet history teaches that nations are not forged only in comfort. They are forged in trials, in the willingness to bear hardship for the sake of independence. And in that sense, Burkina Faso's gamble reflects a wider African awakening. Across the continent, citizens are asking whether aid without respect is worth the price, whether dependence without dignity is survival at all. In the Sahel dust, seeds of a new order may already be taking root. An order where small nations refuse to be voiceless, where sovereignty is not a privilege granted by global institutions, but a right defended by those who bleed for it. The crossroads remains uncertain, but one truth resounds. To stand tall is always to risk standing alone. And so the question remains, if one small landlocked nation can, what stops the rest? Picture two flags. In New York, the blue banner of the United Nations still flutters high above marble towers. In Ouagadougou, that same flag is quietly lowered, while in the streets, young Burkinabés raise the banner of the Alliance of Sahel States. Two images, worlds apart, yet bound by a single act of defiance. For diplomats, the expulsion of a UN envoy on the 18th of August, 2025, may be remembered as a breach of protocol, a reckless gamble. But for ordinary citizens, it is remembered as something else, the moment their leaders said enough. Enough of reports that confuse sacrifice with savagery. Enough of dignity being treated as negotiable. This story is not only about Burkina Faso. It is about the universal question of who gets to define justice in times of war. Can small nations speak for themselves, or must they always be spoken for? Can Africa set its own narrative, or must it remain trapped in words drafted elsewhere? The answer, at least for Captain Ibrahim Traoré, was clear. Sovereignty is not for sale. In his choice, many across the continent saw a mirror of their own aspirations. The defiance of Ouagadougou became a symbol not of isolation but of emancipation. Yes, the risks are real. Without cooperation, humanitarian programs may suffer. Without dialogue, diplomatic channels may fray. But history rarely remembers the comfort of compromise. It remembers the courage of those who chose dignity over dependence. And so, when whispers of a tentative assassinat Ibrahim Traoré echo through rumors and headlines, they remind us of a deeper truth, that courage carries cost, and that those who challenge the world's strongest institutions do not do so without danger. Yet they also remind us that dignity once claimed cannot easily be silenced. This moment will echo beyond borders. It may inspire, it may alarm, but it will not be ignored. Burkina Faso has declared that even the smallest of nations can raise a shield of sovereignty and make the world listen. If this story stirred your sense of justice, share it, not for numbers, but so that the voice of Africa continues to echo. Because dignity once spoken must never be forgotten.